United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So at this time, for the presentation of the proposed 2021-2022 school budget, I will turn it over to Dr. Frenchco for his presentation.
Everybody, nice to see you. I have a presentation here that we've actually been working on since October. So what you see here tonight is pretty much the final project. And the project comes after lots of people's eyes on it, lots of input. A lot of people see it in the audience tonight have played a part in the budget process. Our principals, Director of Technology, Ruthie Cook here, our Assistant Superintendent has really done an amazing job of feeding information and data and crunching numbers. So I'd like to give her some credit right now. It's very, very much deserved. And so the board has been through these presentations more times than they care to count, but tonight they'll see a lot of the information they already know about. And certainly the numbers have not changed since the board adopted the budget last week. But here we go. I'd like to welcome you to the Johnstown Performing Arts Center too. It's kind of nice to be out here in the open as well. And I like to start with this quote, because I really do believe that a budget, for me, of course it's about numbers, but it's not just about numbers. It's really about the values that your community places on your educational system. And of course, the mission should guide us along the way. I highlighted a few words in gold that really feel important in this budget. So as we look at the mission, we are here to provide and support for kids, but a diverse and quality academic program, collaborating with our community, imparting knowledge, skills, and the ability for our children to go out into the world and be the best people they can be, the best citizens they can be. And before I go into the goals a little bit, I want to encourage you to ask questions along the way. Feel free to stop me, or you can wait till the end and we'll have time there too. So the board has 5 goals. We took a look at those when I first got here, which was October 1st. And so what I tried to do here was highlight some of the important words, again, I thought were significant, and really this budget aligns with pretty well. So in goal 1, that's really about student readiness. And you'll see some things, you may hear me talk about some things in this particular budget around digital technology, specifically coding and computer science. Goal number 2, there's that diverse word again, personal, applied learning, personal expression. That is all about curriculum values. And third, cultivating staff, which I'm really happy to see a goal like that in our budget, but also in the school district, because the faculty experience, is it that we say happy wife, happy family, or happy wife, happy husband? I'm not sure how that goes, but the truth is happy teachers, happy faculty, happy kids. And that's really important. Student engagement is something we're going to be working on very carefully in the future. Goals 4 and 5. 4 is really about community involvement. Tonight's a good example of that. Effective communication is what stood out to me there. And that's something we can always improve on. Goal 5, fiscal responsibility is a challenge, but I hope through this budget, you'll see that fiscal responsibility, trying for that balance between what our community needs, our kids need, and what our community can afford, basically. Being creative sometimes, and also conservation is a common theme throughout the budget. So we have 3 parts to this presentation tonight. And first is the fiscal outlook, because we would not be able to build a budget without looking into the future first. So we need to know today, sort of, what kind of money and what kind of resources we're going to have 5 to 10 years down the road. So to the credit of this board, that has been their mantra, their focus: long-range planning, long-range planning, long-range planning. So district information part 2 comes first, because it's funny, but there are people in our community that don't know much about their school district at all. So even more than for this audience here, this is going to be recorded and people might look it up later. And I hope through the slides in the second section, people can have some of their questions answered about our school. And finally, the budget components, where we're spending our money. So here's a fiscal outlook. On this slide in particular, a lot of numbers on here, but what I'd like to draw your attention to is the projected revenue, which is the first row there. Go down to where it says projected actual expenditures. And then finally, projected fund balance. Those three items together are very important rows for us to know. And if you look horizontally, you're going to see 6 years represented, and finally ending in 2026. It helps us to see, first of all, assuming certain things about our budget planning, meaning what can we expect the taxpayers to be able to, bear, and what do we expect or anticipate that the state aid is going to be. Also, what are the expenditures looking like? For example, salary and benefits, obviously the largest portion of our budget. What do we know and expect they'll be rising, by year, because they are based on contracts. The contracts have built-in increases. And so there's some knowns here, but in large part it's unknown, and this is a chart of assumptions. So I think what we're looking at here, is what we can reasonably expect at this moment. So if you look where we are right now, do you see the projected fund balance? I wish I had a little red thing, but I don't have one. First column under the years, you'll see $16 million, $16,351,017. That amount is what we anticipate or expect our fund balance to be at the end of the year. That seems like an extraordinary amount. Again, it's anticipated, it's estimated at this point, but that's what we do expect. And you'll see, if you follow that horizontally, that fund balance dwindles with the known revenues that we have, like tax levy, like state aid. So it's really important to keep our eye on the fund balance, because you never want that fund balance and reserves to go below a certain point. You never want to be caught off guard. It's same as your own home. You'd never want to be cut without a savings account that you can depend on if things should go crazy. Projected revenue, that row there, following that across, you can see that revenue goes up, but it's not a huge amount as compared with expenditures. So if you look at expenditures starting at 34,755,280, that was this year's current budget. Next year, or the budget that I'm presenting tonight, we're proposing a budget that is higher than $37,962,282, but this again is the projected actual expenditures, because schools don't spend always what they budget. I need everybody to understand that. You always budget high because you don't want to be caught in a place where you have to spend money because you're not authorized to spend more money than you budgeted for. So if something should happen, it's really important that that's an actual, that's what we anticipate or estimate we will actually spend, but anything could go wrong. Look at what happened with COVID. So I guess we do assume a 2% tax levy here. So property taxes, if you look at that row, our district is funded about 25%, Ruthie, by taxes. About 65% of this, our funding comes from the state and federal governments. The other is just other revenue, which is tuitions, pilot programs, interest on reserves, things like that. So last year, if you see property taxes, we were at 5% tax levy increase. This year, we're proposing a 3.8% tax levy increase. And following that, we're just assuming a 2% tax cap. Not that that's what it's actually going to end up being, but this is how we do the long range planning. So by the time we get to 2026, we just got to be mindful that expenditures increase. Aid does not increase at the same rate. We've got to be careful of how we spend our fund balance, which is the reason we have a fund balance reserve plan also. So I don't know if there are any questions there. I'm going to go on to the next slide, because I think what's coming up will explain even more to you. So a historical view of revenue, expenses, and fund balance. If we go back to 2011, You'll see the purple bars are the revenue. We're in a pretty decent place at one point. Right around 2014, well, earlier, 2013, it looks like our expenditures started to outpace our revenues. And there are reasons for that. And Ruthie is really knowledgeable about many of the reasons. In 2015, you'll see a really big difference between the total revenues and the total expenditures. And Ruthie, do you want to just highlight that for a second?
So what happened in 2015, so you'll see like Dr. Crenshaw had said, in 2013, the district started deficit spending. We started spending more than we were taking in every given year. In 2015, the district received a pretty sizable amount of retroactive state aid. So state aid that had been withheld in previous years during the Great Recession was returned to the district. So that spike in revenue was not operating revenue. So it wasn't a favorable operating year. It was that extra state aid that the district received. If we had not received that in that year, that also would have been a deficit spending year. But that allowed the district to set up the reserve plan and begin to do some long range planning to set money aside for those known liabilities that they would be incurring.
Which we still have today. And then if you follow 2016, 2017, 2018, you see how that deficit spending continues where our total revenues fall below our expenditures. I think it was around 2017, 2018, the district got that wake up call and they decided we better do something. And so I think what we're seeing now, and I think a next slide is going to be the trajectory kind of changes, but we still have work to do. So fortunately, 2019, 2020, you're going to see total revenues outpacing expenditures. That is clearly because last year, COVID expenses or COVID caused expenses not to be as much as we anticipated they would be. You know, we didn't have transportation for a period of time. We didn't have students coming to school. I'll get to this later, but almost 25% of our staff had been cut since 2017. So there are all sorts of things that play into this. And then finally in 2020, we're even in a better place because this whole year we've had some savings. We haven't had athletic seasons. That's an important thing to remember too. So what to do with the money that we saved is really on the board's mind right now. Looking into the future, you can really see that our goal is to keep things pretty even, but still, even with the best intentions and with some of the anticipated knowns, I would say, thinking about tax levy, thinking about what state aid we have coming in, our expenditures continue to outpace our revenues, and we have to try to do something about that. And that's where the creativity comes in handy. That's where sometimes budget cuts come in handy. That's sometimes where really creative spending practices come in handy. Spending through BOCES so that you're getting aid back on some of your expenditures. There are all sorts of techniques that we can work through, but what we know now, kind of looking into the future, we know that expenditures are always going to outpace revenue. It's just the way it is. And typically we're going to make up that gap by allocating some of our fund balance to fill that gap. And that's something we don't want to have in very large proportions. So we know looking into the future, this white line that trends down is what our fund balance potentially looks like. We can't keep spending down our fund balance either. So, you know, it's important to have these views. Maybe it's not a perfect rosy picture, but I think it's better to be real and know up front where you're heading so you can fix it in advance. Anything you would say, Ruthie?
I was just going to say, you know, kind of the key thing there is, and this is what the Audit, Budget and Finance Committee has been working on, to keep our day-to-day operations, to keep the purple bar and the gold bar close to each other on the day-to-day, you know, paying the teacher salaries, things like that. And then use those reserves and do a lot of planning out into the future with those and use those for liabilities that are not day-to-day. So we use that to purchase buses. We use that to do necessary maintenance. We use that to do some known retirement liabilities that we have. So that planning is going to be key. So as that white line is going down, we'll want to be not spending that on our day-to-day just regular day-to-day
Mhm.
operations. We want to be spending that on those other things that we know we have to purchase, more one-time kind of liabilities.
So what Ruthie's really talking about is the reserve plan. So the district, by I would say the end of May into June, we'll have a really better idea of where we're ending up this year and what our reserve plan needs to look like. So where we need to put money so that we're not taxing people further for money that we already have saved that could be applied to the purchase of buses, to capital projects, to workman's compensation, to all sorts of labor-related costs too, if possible. So, our goal is really, this is so hard to see.
Dr. Crenshaw,
Yes, sir.
that last slide, those expenditures and revenue.
Yep.
That's forecasted a 2% increase.
This is just a 2% tax cap or tax levy. This is also 2% state aid. So it's pretty conservative, I would say. And it's also projecting what we think are going to be the labor costs, and contract costs. But we have a couple of really interesting dynamics there too, because we'll have some retirements, and it's interesting how that cycle works. But we're always taking a look at all those pieces. And this slide actually matches the first table that you saw.
Yep.
Anyway, this slide, although it's hard to see, the red is sort of where we were heading. So that gap between expenditures and revenues was really widening. And so the district saw that several years ago. The purple, which is super hard to see, is kind of where we expect to be. And we'd like to continue trying to close that gap, because the idea is you don't spend more than you have. But oftentimes that's hard to do in a school situation. So a little bit about combined student enrollment and staffing levels. You can see the yellow line on top. The yellow line represents student enrollment. So we definitely have had a decline in student enrollment. I would be careful going out there looking at student enrollment, because there are several data points. Even the state of New York doesn't agree on the data points. So what we know, we have students today. We know we had students on what's called Beds Day back in October. We know what the New York State report card says, but it's really important to know that overall student enrollment has declined. But if you look at the red, it really has not declined the same as teaching. The teaching roles and support staff roles has declined. I'll get to that later. Teaching assistants, you can see we've had a little uptick in that. The purple line at the bottom, right around 2015, 2016, and that is purely because teaching assistants are a licensed professional, and we used to hire more aides, and those aides were asked to become teaching assistants, and so that helps with instruction, coverage for students. And so we have less aides, more teaching assistants. And then finally, the blue line is pretty steady, but that is our administrative staff right there at the bottom. And a little bit more about the elementary staffing. You can see the trending of staffing, which is the purple bars, keeps with the elementary enrollment. So the district's done a nice job of really trying to match the declining enrollment of students with staffing. Same goes for secondary as well. And it was very important for us to see which academic areas we had and which ones, declined and which ones didn't necessarily decline. I think the story here is that English, science, math, social studies have been decreased cuts, but also there have been shifts in our student populations going to P-TECH. That continues into the next year, which means enrollment reductions for us. Foreign language doesn't have much in the way of impact. We do offer Spanish, and the district has really tried to right-size its staffing with enrollment, student enrollment. And other staffing enrollment trends, just, our music, art teachers, psychologists, counselors, that sort of thing. Also in somewhat decline as well, special education teachers. Here's a slide I showed last time we met as a board before the board adopted their budget. These data are from the New York State report card. It shows our June 30th enrollment for those years, and you can see how that enrollment continues to decline. That's something we'd like to reverse, but to reverse that, a lot of it's out of our hands. People need to have more children. People need to move into the district. We have to be an appealing district too. There's a lot that goes into that. The teacher count has gone down by 22.4% since 2017-18. So that's important to note for us. The impact of state aid and federal aids. This is a teaching piece that we covered last time we met. I think what you need to know as public is something the board already understands. We were really fortunate just a couple of weeks ago to see about $400,000 more in state aid come through in what they call formula aid. That was good news for us because we were anticipating a tax levy increase of about 8%. And so almost immediately we said, okay, let's drop that down to about half. And that's why we have a 3.8% tax levy increase proposed tonight. It doesn't include expense-driven aid, which is money we actually get back from capital projects, from BOCES spending. We do get money back when we spend with those entities. And so that's another piece of aid that we can control some of that. There are two grants out there, two federal grants you may have heard about in the news. One is, we had to correct this today because we actually got the guidance today. We actually got the allocations for real about, it was afternoon, I think.
Yeah.
And so we incorporated them into these slides, and now we just got to know how we're expected to spend it. So basically the CRRSAA grant, Federal Government Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, $1.34 million. That was enacted back in December. It's not for general budget application, which is why you won't see it in this budget. It's for non-recurring expenses, a lot like fund balance is used. But we plan to use this as a supplementary aid for, things like learning loss, our preparations for reopening in the fall, and other safety upgrades. We're still waiting for guidance on that. And another grant we're fortunate to receive is $3.34 million. That's the ARP, I call it, grant, American Rescue Plan. So that is $3.34 million. Again, not for general budget application, for non-recurring purchases through 24-25. So that's about 4 years of expenditure. Can be used for learning loss again, preschool enhancements, technology, student engagement, enrichment, that sort of thing. There are stipulations of how we can spend that money and when. And so we need to know more about that. But basically we have to reserve 50% of it and spend 12.5% of it over the next 4 years, which is that other 50%. So a lot of unknown, but we plan with that money to fund some AIS teachers because we know there's going to be learning loss, behavioral specialist, community outreach specialist, transportation for UPK potentially, if we can make that work. And part two, I might sail through that a little bit because as I'm looking out into the audience, most of you do know Johnstown. And I'm just being real about that. I think I know you well enough to know that. So I might breeze through some of these things, but again, for people who don't know Johnstown as well as they'd like to, and they want to see this, they'll be able to read through these slides. Does that sound okay to the board? All right. So basically in this slide, defining the basics of Johnstown. Most people don't know we're 22 square miles and what towns we touch and what the median income is around here and what a single household median income is. And all these things play into our thinking when we go into the budget. More about the district. This is our campus today. We still have the 6 buildings. They're all used very differently than they used to be used. Also, we serve between 1,500 and 1,600 students. Sorry for that broad, range, but that's truly what we're serving, depending on the day you're going to look at the data. What we strive for here, and a little bit about how we're organized. We have a board of education, superintendent. What's our leadership team look like? Finally, by the numbers, it's important for us to know that student population decline since 1978, 1,000 pupils, but only about less than 1% average annual decline. Teachers, other service providers, support professionals, we hire all those, administrative staff as well, and we go into some detail about those. Many people think that we're just okay. Well, we're what's called an average needs school. And an average needs school is different than a high needs or a low needs. Your high needs schools, We have those around us too. Gloversville is constituted as a high needs school, for example, where Bethlehem or, Niskayuna is a low needs school. And we all get aided differently because of those reasons. So most people don't know that over 50% of our students are economically disadvantaged. That's a far cry from what it was 10 years ago. And our graduation rate is on the incline, I'm really happy to say, but be careful about the data too, because it's anywhere from 88 to 92% graduation rate as of last year. Before that was right around 80% if you look at the students who took 5 years to graduate versus those who took 4 years to graduate versus those who took 6 years to graduate. So we've got to be very particular about our data. Also, the expenditure per pupil changes year to year as well, but we are well below the state average at this point. Johnstown spends just under 20,000 and the state average is I would say near $26,000. And then, why should I support the school district? The things that we're looking for, the beliefs that we have here. How is my money used? It's important to know some of the things I've already told you about what percentage of our budget is actually funded by taxpayers, who you're paying for, and don't forget BOCES and P-TECH. All those programs are funded through this budget. They help us maintain and sustain what we have. We have a rapidly changing world here, and if you have an old paradigm understanding of education, it's really quite time to change that. I mean, we are 22 years into the 20th century. And I used to say 10 years. I used to say 13 years, and things weren't changing that well. But boy, COVID has helped us a lot. We've learned things about ourselves and about technology that I think are going to find useful in the future. But these 21st century practices, we should be maybe in a different place, but it's not just us. I think it's nationally. I think it's our school paradigms. We are a targeted school district. We right now are trying to work our way out of being a targeted school district, and I think doing that pretty well. Mostly we're cited for things like attendance and graduation rate, and I really commend the principals and all the teaching staff. We have some additional funding for pulling us out of there. Here is the main thrust of why you came tonight. So the expenditures, we are recommending a budget with the 2.5% increase over last year. And if you look at the change numbers, the proposed budget for this year, in each of these three components, administrative, program, and capital, that makes up our total budget. And that is how the state of New York likes us to divide these up and explain them too. You can see the changes. In program, you see a change of almost $1 million. Well, that is attributed to mostly salary and benefits increases. And capital, you'll see a decrease. And overall, that total $992,700, 2.5% increase. And I think you'll see why in the next few slides. Also in that program number, you're going to hear later about us proposing to add a math teacher at the high school to offer some computer science courses. There are additional special education costs and so on. So the revenues that we expect here is just a summary really of what state aid we have received. The federal aid is really no change ever. That has not changed in years actually. Appropriated fund balance, the money we're taking from the fund balance to close that gap between reserves and expenditures, and an interfund transfer of $70,000, which we didn't have last year, other revenue, and finally a total budget proposed of $39,967,989 for an overall year-to-year change of that 992.7, which you saw in the last slide. So we are asking the taxpayers for a 3.8% tax levy increase. It is at the cap. It is what the state allows us and suggests, by the way, that we raise for our community to fund our schools. And a little bit more into the proposed revenues. I think it's really good sometimes to see where that state aid is coming from and how it's split up. So expense-driven aids, again, those aids that we get back from expenditures in any given year. So if we send students to P-TECH or to CTE programs, or we purchase programs and services through BOCES, capital projects. That money comes back to us in certain percentages the following year. And so foundation aid is the big number. This year, we're really, really impressed that the state saw this flaw in the foundation aid formula. They increased us by nearly $400,000. Huge help. Excess costs, special education costs, really, money we get back from spending on special education, instructional resources, pandemic-related adjustments. Ruthie explains that best, I think, that $440,
So,
if you don't mind.
yeah, last year at this time, the state was telling us in our state aid runs, they straight up told us that they plan to take away about a little over 400,000 of our state aid. So they reduced our state aid allocation by that amount, and then also had said more reductions may be coming. So we had budgeted for that last year, expecting that we wouldn't be getting it because that's what the state had indicated. So that's why we're seeing a swing in our budget, in our revenue budget this year, because there are no reductions related to the pandemic from the state side.
Ruthie, do you remember when we knew that that would be coming back to us? Which time of year?
It was in the winter, so we had applied for it's coming back to us in the form of grants that we had to apply for, and it was kind of a lengthy process. And we actually have just recently the approval to get not all of that money, but most of that money back.
That's important to know, because if that's found money, you would expect that we could decrease the tax levy again by another $400,000. But we had already built that idea of an 8% tax levy increase based on what we knew, even knowing that that money was coming back. So it was really the foundation aid change that helped us. The estimated tax impact, I think, is of interest to people, depending on the city or town, the municipality you live in, and depending, frankly, on what the equalization rate ends up being, which is about August. We kind of know the equalization rate for each of these municipalities. These are the tax rate increases we're looking at per dollar. I still haven't fixed that. The tax rate per thousand, and finally per $100,000 for the year. And a little bit about the appropriated fund balance. Slide 34, back then, there was an appropriation of funds to close the gap between expenditures and revenue, like I was talking about earlier. That comes, we try to lessen that gap. And without appropriating this type of fund balance money to fund the budget, there would be that gap that continues between that purple and red line that you saw. Ideally, our budget would be balanced, so we wouldn't have to use reserve money to do that. But I just think it's an inevitability of a school district in these times that you'll never have the revenue to cover your expenditures unless you continue to plan ahead, plan your reserves, spend wisely, and just keep that dynamic going. It's an exhausting and ever ongoing process to try to keep that gap manageable. So here are the budget components. The administrative, the smallest part, blue, 8% of our budget. Capital, 20% of our budget. And finally, program, the most important part, touches kids, teachers, programs, services, 72%. Our administrative budget is a $3,179,162 whatever. I know how to say these numbers, I just do, but after a while. But this is the portion, this is the dollar amount of the portion. That goes for Board of Education, Central Admin, me, Finance, which is Ruthie, our legal advisors and personnel, our office staff there in the administrative offices, Supervision Improvement, our principals, their secretaries, central offices, or any budget that we have that accompanies the administrative realm. And so here are the changes year to year in the administrative portion of the budget. I'll just let you take a look at those for a moment instead of reading through those for you. We're looking at a total administrative component increase of $95,714 for a 3.1% increase year to year in that component only. So a little bit about, I think for those people who want to know more, what is encompassed in that administrative portion again. This slide goes to explain the Board of Education, the central administration, the finance, legal and personnel, administrative supervision and improvement, central services and special items. There's a lot of information in each of those components. Let's move to the capital portion of the budget, the next largest portion of our budget, $8,165,298. 20% of our budget. Let's look into the pieces of the capital budget. That's the operation of plant and maintenance of plant. That includes our custodians. That includes, their contracts and their salaries and benefits, insurances, refunds on property taxes when that has to happen. Other contractual expenses. We have a capital outlay project in this budget for the first time, I think, ever in Johnstown's history, and that is meant to expend this year on a capital improvement that we call a small project. And that gives us about $90,000 the following year. It's a great way to spend money on things that need attention in the district in a physical plant kind of way. So I'll explain a little bit more about that to come. Debt service, central data processing, and employee benefits there. This has actually gone down, so 0.6% or negative $48,859. Again, these slides just explain a little bit further what operation of plant means, maintenance of plant, the insurance, and so on. So a little bit about this capital outlay that you'll see in the budget. The $100,000 project, districts can do these, and most districts do them, and I'm happy that Johnstown will ask the taxpayers to support this, because basically it's a capital maintenance project of no more than $100,000. And if you know anything about construction, $100,000 doesn't go very far, especially with a school, but they're meant to be very small projects that we can spend money on and get most of that money back from the state later on the following year. So of the $100,000, let me just go to the next slide, because I think this will show you what we plan. So this capital outlay project we propose here, we should get 92 cents back on a dollar the following year. Our initial plan is, of course, we have to pay architects and legal fees and all sorts of things. That's about 20,000 of that 100,000. 70,000, we tentatively plan, this cannot be exact, but we tentatively plan to work on from some spalling that we know is happening to the pool wall. If that comes in with an estimate that we can actually afford, we'll go ahead and do that. But we have to have $10,000 of interior improvements. Funny enough, the pool wall spalling is considered interior improvements. So there's about 80,000 actually for that wall. We have a plan B, but a lot of this depends on, there's a whole process. So if the estimates come back too high, then we'll have to come up with a plan B. And it's really important to tell the public that, because we can't spend more money necessarily than we have. So finally, the largest portion of our budget, the program portion, you'll see $28,623,529, just where the money needs to go. Teaching of academic subjects, transportation, special education, our library and media, data, technology, textbooks, BOCES programs, P-TECH, CTE programs, and salaries and benefits, all those things. Instruction is highlighted here because I'm going to go into a bit more detail, but below that, you'll see how district transportation is funded in this budget, interfund transfers, employee benefits also. So instruction, in the next slide, you'll see that's an $888,347 change. Overall, the program year to year is a 3.4% increase. So a little bit more about instructional spending. So regular school is really teaching and all the support staff. Special education below that is parsed out differently, but that is our teachers and our programs as well. Media and educational technology, student services and activities. And you can see where the $888,347 comes from. Now, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into the regular school, just so you can see how that money is spent on salary increases, non-salary increases. So for every salary we have, there's also workman's compensation, there's retirement, all those other accompanying benefits. Non-salary increases and proposed staffing, which I'll get to also. We do have a couple of proposed new staffing positions in this particular budget. If you remember back, I said 22.5% of our teaching staff has been cut since 2017. But I think our children need, not just me, but I think our principals, we've all kind of weighed in on this. And we thought, what do our children need moving forward? And so we're taking a pretty conservative approach, but we're talking about an additional math teacher, and I'll tell you why in a second, a behavioral specialist, and also, there's one more, art teacher. So art teacher. Included in this portion also our transportation component. We have a transportation safety plan, and that to me means you know exactly what you're going to need to replace and when you're going to need to replace it, because you got to keep your fleet in good shape. So basically we're looking at 3 66 passenger school buses. We have a reserve that's going to actually pay for this. So it's not an additional tax levy increase based on transportation. We have a reserve we're actually going to use to pay this full shot. HFM Transportation is who we contract through. And then finally, you know, we have a pretty good safety record, and that's really important to note as well. So a bus, a 66 passenger bus, roughly costs about $130,000. And after aid, it's going to cost us about $13,000. And that's just true. These are actual estimates that come from the busing company. Roughly 90% of our costs are kind of recouped by state aid. And here's an idea of our plan. You can see it up here. So basically we are purchasing 3, sometimes 2 buses in one case a year. And you can see the lifespan of that lavender row is taken over by a darker purple, and that's when we need to replace those buses. So we kind of got the bus numbers all wrapped up into that. That's just a very big picture of the transportation replacement planning. So you can expect to replace 3 buses a year with this plan, and that's a very good practice. Keeps our fleet nice and safe. Some of this information here on this slide, a lot to read, and I don't expect you to read it all. But in a nutshell, we really wanted to preface why we're trying to add 3 positions to the faculty and staff. Again, we've had a pretty important decrease in staffing, arguably, maybe more than we would have liked. I think some were necessary to close that budget gap. And I think that's one of the reasons the district did that, was to put us in a better fiscal shape now and into the future. But there are a few things that we need to think about. So the fiscal crisis, the next bullet there, you know, we always have to be dependent on the state aid foundation formula. You know, grants, projecting into the future is really important to us. We do realize that those grants that we just talked about are going to hit a fiscal cliff one day, and they're not going to be there for us. They run out. And so we've got to be ready to pick up where they left off. And we have to do a very careful job of what we count on and what we don't count on. Third bullet, the district needs to ensure appropriate staffing levels for kids. And that's about safety, but that's all about a quality of education as well. And finally, the fourth bullet, we have mandated services and programs. I don't think anybody can forget about that. There are things that must happen that we don't have control or say over. And that's a large portion of this budget. Let's see here. So here are the positions that I keep talking about. And we've allocated roughly $80,000 thinking this. What is it going to take to get a good teacher, be competitive, and also all the salary related benefits and health insurance. So we look at the worst case scenario. So the art teacher, at the elementary school. Currently, we have one teacher serving over 700 students. It's just not sustainable. And we've been doing it because it's COVID and because we were in really rough shape. And art is mandated, but the instruction or the instructor is not necessarily mandated at the elementary level. But you're going to get so much more for your children with an instructor who is certified to teach. And so split that number in half, we're looking at about 350 or more students per teacher, and that is a little bit more realistic. Questions on that? Zig, have you recovered yet from that? Former art teacher? There you go. We can't afford you. Just kidding. Behavioral specialist. If you know special education, you know that we continue to have students joining our school system that are deficit in areas of behavior, social emotional wellness, and we have a number of kindergarten students we know already from having worked with them in their preschool years that we are going to have in our school system next year who are going to need a tremendous amount of supports. And that's one of the reasons for the behavioral specialist, but also behaviors of children. There's so many more challenges that we're paying attention to now. Maybe they were always there, but I don't think so. But we are negligent if we're not paying attention to them. So the behavioral specialist is really about helping our gen ed teachers to deal and cope, have the strategies to work with children who have difficult behaviors, but also we have literal special education needs that are manifest through behaviors that we must attend to. And so that behavioral specialist is an important resource for us. For sure. The secondary mathematics teacher, this is really interesting because we were designated a couple months ago, thanks to the efforts of Bob Kramer, Nicole Panton, who's not here, as an Amazon Future Engineer School. And that kind of goes to grades 6 through 12. And because of that, we can offer 2 additional AP classes in computer science, 6th grade coding classes, which will expand into more grades. And so we are planning on utilizing one of our current math teachers who's also certified in that area to teach some of those computer science courses, but we'll have that gap and we need to fill that. So that's an exciting opportunity for Johnstown, something relevant we can offer our children. I graduated Johnstown in 1984 and I took computer science from, Dick, help me out. Was it Mary Foster, Mrs. Foster. Anyway, that's on her. But we had many computer science courses. We used to have 4 business teachers here. We had a pretty robust computer science and business department here at one time. And it's just really time, especially in this technology rich environment, to bring those courses back. That's the relevant stuff our kids need. That's what they want to go into for college too. So a little bit about those 3 positions there. And we need to be reminded of what has changed. So since we've been in school, technology has come a long way. Societal and community dynamics have changed so much. We now are just over 50% poverty in Johnstown. That's a far cry again from what we've had even 10 years ago. There's a concerning out-migration from New York State to begin with, and the idea is to be somewhat competitive here. The mandates continue to come. So they're usually unfunded. Fortunately, the state saw through that and they gave us that extra foundation aid money. We expect more mandates because with more laws come more mandates for schools. COVID-19 has obviously had tremendous impact on us as well. Accountability in education has increased. Social, emotional, and mental health decline is astounding in our students. Health insurance costs, I literally chose these words intentionally, exorbitant and volatile, because we almost never know what those costs are going to be. And they are way outpacing any salary increases that we could find. And the state formulas for funding education are certainly outdated. This year they were sufficient. Who knows what the state's going to do in the next couple of years. So we're almost at the end here, which you'll probably be happy to know, but On the subject of tax levy decisions, the things that we need to continuously keep in mind that we must improve are, we know the budget long-range forecast in general with certain assumptions. We're experiencing years in which we've asked taxpayers to support a higher tax rate. This is the first year in 4 years we've asked for no more than just the tax cap. It's important to know. We're doing that intentionally. We're working on that intentionally. We have been right sizing as a district. We're reimagining and restructuring things. Even with a 2.5% increase in our budget from last year, I believe we're acting responsibly to try to give our students what they need and, be cognizant of what our public can, our community can afford. And I would say that the third bullet, we will improve and maintain our program health, remaining both educationally and fiscally solvent. In my line of work, what you'll hear superintendents talk about is solvency. So you can have two kinds. You can be out of money and be insolvent financially. You can be out of good education, and that can be educational insolvency. And we have to avoid both, because with fiscal sometimes comes the educational. We can't go there. Can't go there for Johnstone. There's too much riding on it, and our kids get one shot at this. So that's why we try to do a really good job with this budget, building in a few things, trying to be responsible with our spending. Here are the continuous challenges we have coming. So the appearance of increased spending in light of decreased student enrollment, unstable government aid, fiscal distress for many people in our community. We understand these things are happening. So as we go about building a budget, we do have these things in mind, which help us navigate the budget process. But those are not going away. There will be people who more and more cannot afford taxes. There are people, we don't know from year to year always what the state aid is going to be. And also student enrollment should continue to decline, if not regionally, certainly New York State. Our goal is to try to gain student enrollment back because we want to be the natural choice for student enrollment in Johnstown. So balancing again what our community can afford with the education our kids deserve, to plan and manage our resources for known or anticipated unavoidable liabilities. And next bullet is relying on state formulas, including tax cap formula, which essentially suggests to the school what the state expects us to raise, and other formulas. So the future of revenue, so what we're going to get in aid is really hard to know. And then finally, the COVID-19 concerns. We anticipate that these concerns will last 5 to 10 years from now. So whatever ground we've lost is going to take a number of years to get back, and we have to fund a budget. We have to fund a school system that will help us get there. Important to know, the board has a lot of knowledge about the contingency budget now. I think in the event that this budget does not pass, the district has choices. So they can put the budget back out there as is, they can adjust it, or they can go right to a contingency budget, which is a 0% tax levy increase. So that is that $393,247. So the district could appropriate more in fund balance. They certainly could, to come up with that gap but I wouldn't recommend it. It's more likely we would make ongoing cuts to programs and services. Some of those additional cuts could be, please don't quote me, these are not ultimatives, they're not definites, but some extracurricular activities, this is where we would look. Some athletics, field trips, the counseling service we contract with, the contract risk prevention services, any supplies and equipment must, we cannot increase any equipment costs, and we actually have to cut some equipment costs. That's in the music, art, athletics, maintenance, technology, all those areas. So with a contingency budget, those things do not increase, and even in some situations have to be cut. And finally, professional memberships and professional development for our teachers, which I would never recommend either. We have proposition. Yes, sir.
Go back to that.
Yep.
So just to clarify, sometimes people see these slides put in here and they think we're using this as a scare tactic to have people vote a certain way. That's not the case. The district is required to come up with a contingency budget and present it to the voters as what that would look like. So this isn't a tactic to say, this is why you need to vote for the budget. This is information to provide you with what we're required to provide you if the budget doesn't pass and the board does go to a contingency budget, either by not going out for a second vote, or if the second vote were to fail too, this is what we would be looking at. So I just want to clarify that, because every year we hear, well, you use all these avenues to kind of force the voters into voting for the budget. No, this is another requirement that a lot of people don't know that we're required to present at this particular point.
Yep. And we actually have given this quite a bit of thought, if it should come to it. The propositions, which you'll see in your newsletter, which I think by law, we can't actually send out until tomorrow. It has to wait until the next day after the hearing. So you should be getting those in your homes soon. Proposition 1 is on the budget itself. Proposition 2 is authorizing the school district to spend from the capital reserve for transportation, the money on the buses, the 3 buses. Proposition 3, this particular board is also hoping to fund that capital outlay project in the budget, the one that kind of makes money for the district, using existing reserve funds. So that's also not an additional tax levy burden, additional. And then finally, Proposition 4, the board is seeking the public's opinion on moving from a 9-member to a 7-member board, and that wouldn't start until 22-23, I believe. Is that Lorraine here somewhere?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I also?
Yep.
Oh, so
Please, yeah.
in this particular instance here, a lot of people have asked why we would consider going from a 9-person board to a 7-person board. So there's several reasons that went into this decision making. As you've seen in the previous slides, our enrollment has declined, our staffing has declined. The only thing that has stayed the same over that time period is the size of the school board. Most school boards across the state actually operate with a 7 board member. Some even have to operate with a 5-member board. And a couple of the biggest things we face a shortage every year of people running for the board. So you're in that situation where you don't know if you have the write-in candidates. They're not obligated to take the position. So you may be in a position where we're required to appoint somebody, whether it be for a year or 2 years, to fill that gap. So we think a lot of the work can be done, and it's prudent at this time to reduce that number because of the way we've reduced the enrollment in the district. We've consolidated the size of the district as far as our facilities. We can still do this with a 7-person board, and it wouldn't be, if the voters did approve this, it wouldn't just be in 2022, 2 people would be out, and we'd be down to 7 board members. We would work with our legal counsel to put together a strategy as a group of the current board to see how we're going to phase that in. Some board members' terms may be adjusted a little bit to fill it in, because you have to have a certain number of board members up for re-election every year. So it will be an ongoing process of probably at least 2 years, I would say, to get us down to that 7-person board. So those are some of the reasons that we decided to do this. And if the voters did approve that, how we would go about implementing that.
That's great. We do have terms up on the Board of Education. We're fortunate enough to have 3 members running as well. So that's the first time that's happened in several years, at least 3 or 4 years. So we've always had write-in candidates. Several of our board members just became board members because of write-ins, some by 12 votes. So it's interesting. But this coming year, we have 3 open seats this year to come. Mr. Ronald Beck, Mr. Arthur Scrum. Is it Scrum? Thank you. Scrum and Mrs. Jennifer Sponable, both of whom are here tonight. And those are 3-year terms, which would commence on July 1st. And a reminder about the budget vote, May 18th. We'll run that from 11 a.m. to 8 p.m. right here in the Johnstown Junior Senior High School. And that concludes the public hearing presentation. I'm here for questions. Yep.
Could I have you just go back to one slide?
Absolutely. Sure. Which?
First slide that you have, the administrative expenses.
Yes, definitely. Is that the administrative portion where we,
Yeah, when you started, you actually broke out what the administration.
sure, yep,
Your very first pie.
right here then, maybe. This one?
No, your first pie, show me your pie.
Oh, the
Wait,
pie
wait,
right there.
you were right, excuse me, you go back.
Okay,
That one right there.
yes.
Now, there just seems to be a difference in the numbers between what you have there and what is here.
In the,
Specifically, the Board of Education, just that you got a $71,000 number up here, and it's only 17 here, I didn't know if it was
17,000?
17,000 here and 71 up there.
I'm not sure. We should,
Not sure either.
Numbers switched a little bit.
well, they shouldn't switch that much.
That's what I was thinking.
Yep.
Are you
I'm a
looking
numbers
on,
guy. Our I'm a numbers guy.
are you looking on the actual budget?
I'm looking at the budget that you guys.
So
sent.
sometimes what you have to do is that's broken out into a lot of different categories, so that some of it has to be added together to get to
That
that.
was expected, it says Board of Education. Say Board of
Right,
Education.
so that line up there covers things that the board is responsible for, so it is, it's the board, the training
Right on the
required,
website. Turn it out.
it's the, it's records management that the board is responsible for, and, for the election.
Yeah, so this is interesting because the Board of Education sheet is different than the Board of Education there. We have to do a better job next year of aligning this, but this is all of this.
Right,
This Board of Education is all of this. It's not all of this, but it's the district clerk as well. So you have to have this distribution. So I think if you add these numbers.
and some of
Okay,
the,
say what? Thank you.
But that's a good point, because if we can be more clear about that.
and some of these records management also down here, goes into that.
And records management as well.
Yep.
And I just have one other question.
Sure.
And a question like statement. Now, I see that we, you spent about $2 million less this year than what we had in the budget. Now, if by some chance the budget doesn't get passed, why wouldn't we take that $2 million and still offer those things to the kids that were in the budget? Bringing that man back. Why wouldn't we use that money to like, so that we can still have the same offerings to the kids?
That's a good question. So when you have you have a specific item like you just mentioned, I'm assuming you're talking about marching band,
Yeah.
for example. So what people don't realize is that the entire band and chorus program have been offered this year. The marching band, I believe, was out of this budget, this current year's budget, because of what we anticipated we'd be able to cover. So again, we built the budget for this year, last year. I wasn't here, but we built it, and Ruthie probably can tell you better. But we built it anticipating what we could afford and what we would spend. And because of COVID, nobody knew that we would still not all be in school by now. So we just built a budget that we anticipated we could afford, and the money we thought we'd have to expend. We know we over budget because that's a principle that we have to abide by. But Ruthie, do you want to say anything specifically about that?
No, only that, so, and Dr. Crenshaw had mentioned earlier, so we can't spend 1 penny more than the amount that the voters approve. And so we have to plan some contingencies in the budget for things like, if we have, some high need students who move into the district, we have to be able to have enough money in the budget to be prepared for those kind of contingencies, or,
But the voters approved last year, they approved $38 million.
Yep,
Right, we only spent 36.
Yep.
All right, that still leaves $2 million left over.
Yep.
Right, well, they're sitting there, and now we only approve, they both just went down, and it seems to me like we've been short, what, about 380,000, somewhere around there. Why couldn't you take that money that we already had allocated and approved to fund those things, instead of saying that, if it doesn't get passed, we might have to cut this, we might have to cut that. It just seems like it would go a long way.
Yeah, yep.
For the voters to feel a lot more comfortable.
It would, but
We've got the one out.
I guess I just want you to remember that we need to over plan, first of all. And at the time, I think, again, I wasn't here, but you had a budget that didn't pass. And you went out for another try. And then I'm not sure, you finally passed a budget with 5%.
Yep.
And that 5% I think was with something like the marching band out of that budget, because that, at that point, was what the board and the school district thought they could afford. Now, marching band not being offered, for example, it's too late to fund it right now, but this is kind of, we know where we are financially better now than we did back in September, when marching band would have probably been funded better. I'm trying to
Dr. Crenshaw?
address the marching band question specifically, but
Just one other point too.
Yeah.
One of the things that we've really driven with the board is to make sure that the district was focusing on that long-term plan. So your suggestion is very short-term to fix the immediate, but we can't lose sight of that long-term plan and what that $2 million could mean over the next 5 years, instead of just what is it gonna do today for the kids. It's a balancing. So we certainly weigh all of those decisions and what their impacts are, but we don't want to get ourselves back into a situation where we were a couple of years ago. So we really try to avoid those short-term decisions and really look at it in the bigger picture. And what does that $2 million mean as we extrapolate out? When you look at those graphs and you see our fund balance continuing to drop, that's what we have to prepare ourselves for and be careful of. So while your suggestion may have a lot of good points to it, and that may be part of the discussion and part of the strategy, we can't say for sure that we would definitely do that, because we can't lose sight of that long-term goal.
And I just think it should be part of the discussion.
Are you, I'm confused, are you referring to the part that showed the contingency budget where all that stuff was removed?
I'm referring to the slide that you had up when you talked about.
When you're talking, when it shows the contingency budget and what we would lose. So the contingency budget, we can't spend $1 more than what we approved last year.
No, it was approved, you approved to spend $2 million a year before. So I'm saying, you already got approved to spend $38 million last year. You only spent 36, so now you've got $2 million left over. Now if they approve only 38 this year.
So the important part of that.
So you're suggesting use a quarter of that, 500,000, to offset that 3.8% that we would not have gotten.
Yeah,
And that is one strategy. But the concern is you use it now, you don't have it later. So that's what I just wanted to
I think
make sure you understand that that's part of all the discussions that we've been having since October, is to create those different scenarios and then decide what we feel is really in the best interest of the district for the long term.
And the 2 million isn't revenue that we received that we didn't spend, it's money from our savings that we didn't spend. You know, so when that budget that we prepared last year, the revenue that we were taking in would be less than that approved $38 million expenditure, and
so
we were
your
gonna
fund
make that
balance
up with
didn't
our
go down as
savings.
much as you anticipated.
Yep, right.
that's how it's going to end up looking. That's what ends up happening. It's a tough question, because at face value, it seems very logical, but with long-term and long range in mind, we've got to be very careful with that expenditure of the fund balance, I think. But
Thank you.
you should know that marching band is included in this
That's
budget.
what I
Okay,
thought. I wanted to make sure it stayed.
just, it is, yeah,
I did marching band in high school, but I did marching that much better.
nice. Great questions, though. I mean, thank you for those questions. Does anyone else have? Mr. Baker?
Baker, 1604 State Highway 67, Johnstown. Yeah, one of these things, many years ago, I made the statement that there is a business administrator or a superintendent that doesn't like the fact fund balance. They don't. All I know is when I read the paper, in the paper here, probably 3 meetings ago, Mr. Demore asked you what the state recommends for fund balance, and you said 4%. We're gonna have an estimated fund balance at the end of this year of $16,351,017.
Right.
That's 40% plus of the budget.
Yeah,
That's 10 times what the state says that you recommend. You know, that's a lot of money.
it's.
You know, I know we don't know what's gonna happen next year, the year after and all that, and the projection up on that one, you know. But those were, 5 years ago when we started getting in fiscal stress, laid off a bunch of teachers, that those same lines went down. Well, things got worked out and it didn't happen.
Right.
Just saying, I mean,
So Dick, if I could call your attention to the line where it says, it's almost toward the bottom, it says unassigned. I gotta get my glasses on. Ruthie, can you?
Second from the bottom.
Second from the
Yeah.
bottom, I think it says unassigned.
Projected fund balance unassigned.
Yep, and then, or is it,
Yeah, so.
I
that's-
can't see
that's
Rob,
the
but it's
4%. So
That's the 4% of what you assign.
That's what the state recommends is at 4%. This is
Right.
unassigned, which is the, basically,
Right,
cash in the bank.
that's what you estimate of the budgets on those
And-
coming years.
our goal is, Dick, to keep it at 4%. And so everything, all
Well,
the
you're
other,
doing quite a bit better than that.
what's that?
You're doing quite a bit better.
Oh,
than
yeah,
that.
without a doubt. But what we have, our challenge now is to utilize the reserve plan and put the money into carefully designated reserves. Keep it out of that. I mean, if 4% is the recommendation, that's what we try to keep it at. There are many school districts with 7, 8, 12% in that unassigned. But we are proposing that we be thoughtful about keeping that at 4%, but the money that you're talking about will make its way into other reserves
Into reserves for future spending.
for future spending on specific items. Yeah.
Okay, which leads me to,
Can I ask,
Yeah.
so are you talking about this $16 million figure is above the 4%?
Yes. Well, that's,
the $16 million figure, the figure that they had out earlier, what the anticipated fund balance will be at the end of this year that we're in. Obviously, we've got 3 months to go yet, so it's gonna bump it down a little bit, but we're still gonna be pretty close to between 16 and 17 million dollars probably.
The-
Fund balance, leftover money that was budget that we're not gonna spend. That's what fund balance is, right? It's money you got that you're not gonna spend.
we try not, we don't, that 16 is the total of all the reserves and all the fund balance. The actual fund,
Reserves also, like that bus
Yes.
reserve that's out there.
yes, all
That's
those.
in that number.
Yes.
That isn't just
Yeah.
extra cash.
No,
Right.
it's,
Okay, that's what I think, and myself included.
Yep.
Had this vision of, we got $16 million laying around.
That 4% only goes to that unassigned line.
Right, right,
That's the only thing that 4% pertains to.
okay.
and if
The different reserves now,
and Dick, one more thing. I would like the third row up, assigned appropriated.
right?
That is what we anticipate having to spend from fund balance
Take out to add to make the budget balance.
to make the balanced budget. So that's another piece that I think you need to know.
Because like the bus reserve, and I looked on the website earlier in the week one night, and the bus reserve said it had $666,417 in it. That's in that 16 million
Yes.
someplace.
Yep.
Okay, which leads me to question about the bus reserve. I think I know the answer, I remember from talking to Ruthie 30 years ago. And then the night the numbers came up, you get 90% of it paid back over 5 years. Used to be paid back over 2, didn't it? And then the state stretched it out and all that. The money that comes back, does it get put back into the reserve though?
So
Does it or doesn't?
that's part of our reserve planning. It doesn't have to, but that's a decision that the board would make to put that money
When that
back in.
money comes back.
So that then it's there for future. bus
So,
budgets,
right,
future
that would
cycles.
make the reserve last quite a bit longer.
Yes,
Because
exactly.
at the rate that we're going with 666,000, spending 392 this year, you're going to only have $274,000 left in the reserve, which is only
Good
going to
point.
be a little over 2 buses another year. Then you're going to go back out and fund it out of the regular budget. Has the money previously, over the last 4 or 5 years, it comes back from the state for the reimbursement of buses, has been put back into the reserve, the bus reserve fund specifically?
Not in the last 2 years, as we were kind of working out the fiscal crisis,
Has it
but
ever been put back in the bus reserve fund, actually?
prior to that it had been.
Pardon me?
I believe prior to that it
I
had
believe
been.
prior to that, okay. Then one other quick question, it's kind of budget related and that, because there's, I don't know if you can find it, but approximately, Ruthie would maybe know this, what percentage of the taxes are in arrears in our school district? 5%, 15%, 2%, I wouldn't have a clue, what percentage of people don't pay their school taxes, basically?
I don't know that off the top of my head, but the one thing about a city school district is, the city, once we have uncollected taxes,
right?
Eventually, the city has to reimburse the school district, and then the city is responsible for collecting
Okay,
those.
because they have the power to foreclose where you don't, right?
Yes,
On the property.
yep, so that part of it.
That takes time, obviously, and all that time, you're not getting your money, they're not getting theirs either.
Right, so then the city will reimburse us before they get the money back.
Then, is it a fact that when somebody doesn't pay their school taxes, you still have to give the share of the bill to the library? If my school taxes are $1,000 a year, and then the assessment on my bill is $100 for the school, for the library tax. If I don't pay you get any money, you gotta take the $100 that I would have given you to pass on the library, you gotta take it out of the school district budget and send it to the library.
I do, but keep in mind that, so that's not coming out of the school though, because again, the city has made a full on that. So,
Are they very far behind, or every year they catch up so many
They catch
years
up.
behind?
no, they catch up.
They catch up,
Yep, So
so
then they're
you're
behind.
behind on somebody,
Yep,
a certain amount of years, then the city catches it up to you.
the city catches it up to us. So
Right.
the money that we pay from the library doesn't come out of the money that we would use to,
For educational purposes.
Right, it comes from the city when they make a full.
But in the meantime, how, do you have a leeway time that you have to forward to the library, or is there a time in there where you've got money out
We generally get it back within the year.
within the year?
Yep.
Thanks, folks.
And that's a question I asked when I first came here, Dick. How many people actually don't pay their taxes? And it's remarkably low in
It is low.
Johnstown.
Yes.
I don't think it's 5% at all.
I don't think so either.
Yep. Yeah.
We just said, so the audit committee has looked tirelessly at those reserves and restricted reserves, the appropriated, where the money's appropriated. And we've learned a lot since we've taken on this role the past couple of years of what reserves you could in emergency if you needed to, like where you could put the money, but there's so many stipulations associated with, like when you look at that $16 million, it's not like you can just say, are we going to take X amount of dollars out of the bus reserve to offset the budget, or capital outlay project reserve to offset. It's there for those purposes, and that's it. And that's a lot of misconception of what that's, when everybody sees that $16 million, they think we're sitting on a pot of money that we should be using to offset the budget expenses, but we can't.
I realized that reserves have to be spent on what they're designated for. They have to be voted on like we do every year for the buses. But I didn't realize that those numbers, the numbers in the reserves were part of the total of the fund balance.
And just so you know that currently in the New York State legislation, they're actually looking at that 4% number to increase to 6 or 8%, because as Dr. Flinkshaw said,
It's more
most
realistic.
school districts are at 4% level, and really 4%, if you have a year in a crisis like we're in now, 4% really, it's on the border of being enough. So it could be in the next coming year, it could increase depending on what the legislature does to 6%.
And as a future benefit to taxpayers too, we've established here, I think the board is very wise in establishing a capital reserve. So the next time we do a capital project, we're not asking the taxpayers for additional money, but it'll come right from those reserves. We need to invest in that type of reserve in the future so that some of this money will be really helpful there, and it will take the burden off the taxpayers in the future for the next time we have to have a capital project as well. So there are also reserves that we haven't established yet, which we'd like to establish with that money, so. And if you have any additional questions, feel free to call Ruthie or me. We'd be happy to try to answer your questions. There literally is a reason for every dollar. So appreciate your all coming. Thanks, everybody. Sitting through that again. All set?
Okay. All right, well, that'll conclude